What's up guys and welcome back to the Naval Table. Last time I talked about the Orion class of dreadnought or super dreadnought battleships, and this time, following the World of Warships tech tree of British battleships, I will take a closer look at the Iron Duke class, which will be represented by HMS Iron Duke herself at tier 5 in said tech tree. And just to get this out of the way, if you did not watch the other episodes on the lower tier British battleships, I highly recommend you do so because of some recurring themes and topics like the Battle of Jutland or the Scarborough raid, which in these later episodes will not be explained in detail. Let's get started on the Iron Duke class. The class as a whole is pretty noteworthy for a lot of things, although its design is mainly based on earlier drawings. You could even say that the Iron Duke class is merely an upgrade to the already covered Orion class, and to some extent the King George V class of dreadnoughts, which was a linking part between the two classes and not to be confused with the King George V class of the Second World War. The Iron Duke was a class of 4 battleships. HMS Iron Duke herself, which was built at His Majesty's Dockyard Portsmouth, as is pretty much tradition for the lead ship of a class, and named after the famous Arthur Wellesley, the first Duke of Wellington, who defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. HMS Marlborough, built at His Majesty's Dockyard Devonport and named after John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough. HMS Benbow, built at William Beardmore, Glasgow, and named after Admiral John Benbow, who fought against France in the 9 Years' War, as well as the War of Spanish Succession. And HMS Emperor of India, built at Vickers, Barrow and Furness, which was named after King George V, who at the time was also the Emperor of India. These 4 ships inherited a lot of features from the earlier designs of warships. They still had a top speed of roughly 21 knots, the same as HMS Dreadnought, which compared to later designs is pretty slow, but at the time was more than adequate for a battleship. Most of Iron Duke's design in particular was influenced by the preceding Orion class. Same as Orion, the Iron Dukes had 10 13.5 inch or 343mm guns in 5 centerline superfiring double turrets, although both the turrets and the guns were upgraded versions compared to the older designs. The new guns were now designed as BL or breech loading 13.5 inch Mark V H guns, the H meaning heavy, because this gun now fired a heavier shell with a bigger explosive charge behind it, meaning that the shell could retain the same range as its lighter counterpart, but being more precise and damaging to the enemy. These shells could penetrate the thickest armor the Germans had at the Battle of Jutland at 10,000 yards or roughly 9 kilometers. But a problem with these guns, similar to Orion class, was their elevation. In theory, these guns could shoot out to a range of 21.7 kilometers at a gun angle of 20 degrees. The installed prisms, although, could only manage an elevation of 15 degrees, which would result in a maximum range of about 18.3 kilometers. Every shot taken over a longer distance would therefore be fired blind. The British fixed this problem on the Orions, but for the Iron Dukes the new lenses came too late for the big Battle of Jutland, so during this engagement they were restricted to their maximum range of 18.3 kilometers. Although some sources claim that they fired at ranges of exceeding 24 kilometers, which is physically impossible because the guns could not elevate enough for that. Another upgrade was made to the secondary armament. Instead of the older 4-inch guns, Iron Duke was armed with 12 6-inch 152mm Mark VII guns in casemates alongside the ship. These guns, and now hold fast, could fire out to a maximum range of roughly 14.5 kilometers. Take that wargaming with your tiny ranges for secondaries. Effectively, these guns could engage all targets which the main battery engaged as well, which was the point for the upgrade in the first place. But obviously there was a problem with these guns as well. No new invention or implementation would be complete without some quite hilarious unforeseen problems. In this case, pun intended, it was the casemates. In rough weather, they should have been shut by a couple of steel plates. Yet during rough weather, these plates tended to just rip off, and because these casemates were placed very low in the ship's hull, a lot of water tended to pour in and the ship basically flooded itself. In a later refit, so-called dwarf bulkheads were fitted to the casemates, which did not break off in heavy weather and made the ship actually seaworthy again. And finally, the British managed to solve the problem with the smoke and gas-infested spotting mast. As you can see quite clearly, they moved the forward mast in front of the forward funnel and the aft spotting was done by a separate spotting position in front of the X turret below the line of smoke, which would float right over the aft spotting when the ship was moving. Great stuff right there, which improved the combat effectiveness over all her predecessors. And there's one more thing to note. HMS Iron Duke is actually the first British battleship to have anti-aircraft guns installed onto her. These two quick-firing 76mm guns were installed to defend against airships, not really against aircraft, as the concept of an aircraft attacking a battleship was absolutely unheard of at this point. But let's also talk a little bit about the history of these ships. All four sisters were laid down in early 1912 and were one after the other commissioned from March to November 1914. This meant that the Iron Duke class was the most advanced and deadliest ship class of the Royal Navy before and at the outbreak of the First World War in August 1914 until the arrival of the Queen Elizabeth class, which surpassed the Iron Dukes in December the same year. Nonetheless, these ships were viewed both by the sailors and the public to be the ships to win the war at sea. Because of this, many admirals in many fleets and squadrons chose the Iron Duke class ship as their flagship. HMS Iron Duke herself became the flagship of Vice Admiral Sir John Jellicoe, the commander of the Grand Fleet himself. As this was basically an honor to the ship, the crew of Iron Duke felt what it meant to serve on the flagship of the Fleet Admiral shortly after. Out of all the ships in her own class, she and her crew were ordered to train the hardest. Even before the raid on Scarborough in December 1914, the ship did numerous training missions as well as real sweeps through the North Sea. During the German raid on Scarborough, Iron Duke as well as most dreadnoughts stayed at Scarborough Flow at first, because Room 40, the Admiral's Signals Intelligence Office, did not pick up on the presence of the German High Seas Fleet. When it was clear though that Konteradmiral Hipper's smaller raiding force was supported by the main German fleet, other squadrons of the Grand Fleet, including Iron Duke, were sent out to intercept the Germans. But as the Germans did not want to engage the Royal Navy head-on at this point, they were already almost back at harbor in Germany. In the following months, Iron Duke conducted many more sweeps through the North Sea, as well as mainly gunnery training missions with other squadrons. One noteworthy operation without being a major battle was a demonstration of force off Horn's Reef near the Danish coast, in which Iron Duke was present as well. This operation was planned and made reality to give the Russians in the Baltic time to deploy a defensive minefield. The Russians feared that the German High Seas Fleet might enter the Baltic Sea and then would easily be able to destroy the rather small Russian Baltic Fleet, with the afterward possibility of bombardments and troop landings in major Russian cities. Therefore, the British had to hinder the German fleet to even leave port, which they did without opposition. During the Battle of Jutland, following 1 month later, 3 of the 4 Iron Dukes were present with the Emperor of India undergoing refit and not able to join the fight. As the rest of the Iron Dukes were among the most modern and capable ships, they were positioned at the head of the British battle line, with HMS Iron Duke herself being in the 9th position. All of the 3 ships were heavily engaged in the main afternoon action and fired at various German ships, most notably SMS König, several Kaiser-class ships, SMS Großer Kurfürst, and the light cruiser SMS Wiesbaden. HMS Marlborough was the most heavily engaged ship of the entire class, suffering multiple direct hits and firing 162 main battery shells in return. She also was the one ship to silence the German cruiser Wiesbaden after the ship was engaged by multiple dreadnoughts. Yet Wiesbaden fired off 2 torpedoes, with one of them hitting the Marlborough in return, which reduced her speed to about 16 knots. After this, Marlborough had to undergo repairs at Humber for 3 months. After receiving the fatal shots from Marlborough, Wiesbaden took another couple of hours to sink, with no rescue ships being able to get to her because of the British high-caliber bombardment. Several smaller craft were forced away while being shot at. After the First World War, the most notable action of the Iron Duke class is its involvement in the Russian Civil War. As part of the Mediterranean fleet, Iron Duke herself, being part of the Allied intervention force, sailed into Constantinople and took part in the destruction of material and ships which could be used by the Bolsheviks. After that, she sailed to Smyrna, where she served as operation base for a landing party which should occupy the city's outer forts. After the London Naval Treaty, it was made clear that all Iron Duke class ships had to be scrapped or otherwise demilitarized. In accordance to that, all ships but the Iron Duke herself were scrapped or converted into target ships. HMS Emperor of India was even sunk in a target practice, then refloated and scrapped afterwards. But this was not the end of the Iron Duke. Although she had to be stripped of all removable components that would render her a ship capable of fighting in open warfare, roughly 2,500 tons of armor were removed, as well as some smaller guns, and even 2 main battery turrets, including their guns, were cut off. In total, more than 4,300 tons of equipment were removed from the ship. But on the other hand, some 205 tons of new guns were installed. Guns that should be tested before installing them on other ships, therefore Iron Duke was chosen as a gunnery training ship. At the outbreak of the Second World War, Iron Duke was once again sent up north to Scapa Flow. This time around, not as part of the home fleet, but as a base ship and floating anti-aircraft platform, as some of the new guns in former testing were AA guns. She defended the harbor several times against Junkers 88 medium bombers, although during one of the German raids she was badly damaged as a result of all the armor she was stripped of, and the crew had to beach her. But the most important task she was destined to fulfill was to be placed as a decoy. Iron Duke was supposed to be the centerpiece of a diversion plan. For that, the British also brought 2 merchant ships into the harbor and camouflaged the ships to look like Revenge-class battleships. German air reconnaissance picked up on these ships and fell for it. In May 1941, the German Air Force reported back to HQ that British heavy units of the home fleet were still in port at Scapa Flow, which then influenced the German fleet commander Admiral Günther Lütjens to take the long route through the Denmark Strait with his task force comprising of Bismarck and Prinz Eugen during Operation Rheinübung. It is argued among historians and fans of military history alike that if Lütjens had taken the route directly north of Scapa Flow and south of Iceland into the Atlantic, he and his ships might have slipped through the British blockade fast enough so he would not have been engaged. So technically the Iron Duke in the end helped to destroy the battleship Bismarck. Iron Duke stayed at Scapa Flow during the rest of the war. After the war she was sold for scrap while still being beached there. She finally, after being refloated, found her resting place in the scrapyard of Glasgow. Her bell was preserved though by Admiral Sir Frederick Charles Dreyer, her captain back during the Battle of Jutland, and was placed above the commemoration plaque for him and his wife at the Winchester Cathedral. This is it about the Iron Duke class. Next in line is going to be the also famous Queen Elizabeth class, one of which, HMS Warspite, we already have in game. So I will see you in the next episode. Have a great day.